what Grenfell revealed to everyone was that it doesn't matter how tight the grass is, it doesn't matter how clean the corridors are, if people don't know what to do in an emergency, the building is not safe. I've experienced a couple of major events. One of them was the Barking Riverside fire.
Screaming, crying at the same time, she carried a freezer.
Seeing how that building performs when it's managed correctly versus how it can perform if it hasn't been managed correctly. And the safety elements of that for me was a complete game changer. The panic in a building if something goes wrong and it hasn't been managed well, those instructions aren't there and those residents don't understand what they're supposed to do, completely shifted my mindset on it. Spend money on items that hopefully never have to be used.
Property management at scale is about more than just rent rolls and maintenance calls. It's about protecting your assets, delivering stellar guest experiences, and scaling operations without losing quality. Welcome to Minute by Minute, the show where industry leaders share unfiltered stories, proven strategies, and real solutions for operating at scale. I'm your host, Nils Mattisson, CEO of Minut, and together we will dive deep into what it really takes to keep your properties safe, efficient, and protected. Let's get started. Today we're thrilled to welcome Polly Dyer, a highly respected leader in UK residential property management and a driving force behind raising industry standards. With over 2 decades of experience, Polly is the Property Director at Principal Estate Management, overseeing building safety, portfolio performance, and the operational frameworks that keep residents protected. Before her current role, she worked with several major firms, including HML Group and RMG. In this conversation, we'll explore what it really means for our industry to move from an unregulated landscape to a truly safety-led profession, the gaps that are still to be closed, the realities behind new building safety laws, and how property managers can transform compliance from a burden into a competitive advantage. Polly, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Let's start with your journey, Polly. You've spent more than 2 decades in property management. What initially drew you to the profession, and what's kept you passionate about it after nearly 2 decades?
So property management for me was an accident, which is something you hear a lot in the industry. I started out as an estate agent, working within a business in Hertfordshire. And to be honest, I just fell in love with it. So it really appeals to my sense of things are always moving, things are always evolving, and it just keeps it interesting. I'm not sure I'm the type of person that could work in an industry where you're doing a repetitive tasks, doing the same things over and over. So some days in property management, you're dealing with really high-end specifications, cladding remediation, looking at remediation orders through the courts and things. And then other days, you really are just trying to get the gardening right for someone who's very particular about where they live. So, the variety for me is what really keeps me interested in property management. And then aside from that, I would say the people. It's a passionate group of people who really do care about the homes they look after, the comfort of the people that live in those homes. And we always get a bit of flack at the media, and people reference leasehold, and that which from my experience just isn't the case. It's a lot of very, very passionate people who really do care about people's homes and where they live and what they look like and what their experience is.
I've also found it to be a quite collaborative industry where a lot of property managers are actually very happy to share best practices and help each other out, which is something I appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
What's been something that you changed your mind about over these 2 decades, or maybe something where you've came in with one expectation and reality turned out to be quite different?
So an interesting one. My background from being a teenager, essentially, I joined the Air Force, and the Air Force has a huge safety culture around, the concept that an aeroplane can't take off with a faulty part, the fact that you replace things before they reach the end of their life, because a plane falling out the sky is an extraordinary event. And when I first entered into the property management world, it sort of felt an awful lot safer to me. And sometimes you would see extraordinarily high costs put onto leaseholders around safety management and what that looks like. But actually, the realization for me over time is around why it's so important for the homes to be as safe. Just because they're not in the sky, it doesn't mean that they can't be sort of treated the same way. So when I was originally in property management, so many leaseholders would talk to us about the fact that this was, just wasting their money, and why do we need this other report? Why do we need the, and as time's gone on, I've experienced a couple of major events. One of them was the Barking Riverside fire, and another one was, again, another fire in a building we looked after in Luton, and actually seeing how that building performs when it's managed correctly versus how it can perform if it hasn't been managed correctly, and the safety elements of that for me was a complete game changer. And understanding that it's quite easy in an airport because there's lots of signage up, and you know where you're going, and you know what you're doing, and whereas the panic in a building if something goes wrong and it hasn't been managed well, and that those instructions aren't there, and those residents don't understand what they're supposed to do, completely shifted my mindset on it. And I've ended up becoming really passionate about building safety, which fortunately for me has led into everything that happened after Grenfell, and me being passionate about that and really interested in it. So it could have seemed in my early career that a lot of this just felt like more money for more things, and actually now 20 years in, I'm completely passionate about the fact that these things have to happen, and everybody has to understand what's going, if there's an emergency, how are they supposed to behave? What are they supposed to do?
It sounds like the fruits of experience from my point of view. It's so interesting that you come from a military background, because of course, like that sort of experience, it's quite different from anything that you would see in the private sector. I can absolutely see how you would carry over some of that mindset into property management.
Absolutely, yeah.
You lived through a lot of change, right? Like, so when you started, it was a quite unregulated environment, and today it's quite heavily legislated. And so from your experience, what were some of those early signs that the old system wasn't really working and that the change was coming?
The biggest indicator for me that we needed to move to a regulated industry was very much around the main focus back 20 years ago, makes me feel quite old, but the main focus was things like, make sure the grass is cut, make sure the cleaners are turning up on time. And it was all about the aesthetics of the building. But in reality, in the background, what Grenfell revealed to everyone was that actually doesn't matter how tight the grass is. It doesn't matter how, clean the corridors are. If people don't know what to do in an emergency, then the building is not safe. It can be aesthetically pleasing, but it's not actually safe. So, when you saw these things play out and the reactions of people and how people behaved in emergencies, for me, it was a massive indicator that the industry needed to really step up. And a good building manager back in the sort of early 2000s was someone who, like I say, met the gardener, met the cleaner. That was what a good building manager looked like. Everything was painted, everything was decorated. But by the time we moved past Grenfell, those things are still really important to the leaseholders that live there, but they've got to be managed alongside the safety aspects of the building and making sure people understand what they're supposed to do when things don't go well.
Yeah, it's the difference between the things you notice day to day and those really big, potentially catastrophic events that thankfully happen very seldom.
Yeah.
We struggle a bit with that as well in my line of work, because obviously we're selling a monitoring solution for things that may never happen. But it is quite important to have those like insurance things in place.
That's always the tough sell for leaseholders in particular, and for landlords, where you're continually asking them to spend money on items that hopefully never have to be used. Because that's the perfect scenario, isn't it? We need to make sure all these aspects of the building work perfectly, but we hope they never have to work. we hope they never have to be used. Yeah.
Yeah, you hope that the presence of them and the making the work a bit more visible gives people a sense of safety. And of course, like, people are willing to pay for peace of mind, I think, in other aspects of their life. So I do think with the right communication, it can be good. And So let's dive into a bit more on safety and regulation. So it seems like you saw that stronger safety laws were essential, but it's of course one thing to enact these laws and then another to operationally implement them. So what practical challenges do you as a property manager face when you translate these regulations into day-to-day operations?
One of the challenges that we've been working through since the introduction of the Building Safety Act is the resident engagement element of it and the resident education element of it. So that's been something fascinating, actually, as you watch it unfold. And, there's this expectation that, we need all sorts of different ways to communicate with leaseholders and residents within buildings and things like that. But when we rolled out some of our engagement surveys, the feedback from residents was actually quite fascinating. They expected things to be on notice boards as opposed to, some high-tech solution and stuff like that. They wanted to be able to just stand in their lift and read their fire safety notices because, let's face it, if you're stood in the lift and bored, you're going to read the notice that's in front of you. But the other challenge, I think, has been if you interrogate the current legislation as it stands around competency of both property managers and contractors working within these buildings, in a lot of cases, the journey to become fully competent, if you hadn't already started that journey, can be as long as 2 or 3 years. So it's been a huge challenge in that anyone who wants to stay in the industry has ultimately had to study about a degree level amount of information alongside a full-time job and whatever other care responsibilities they have at home with children and parents and, all the other busy things that have gone on. And they've had quite a short space of time to identify what courses they need to do because the industry wasn't quite ready to upskill everyone, and make sure that you're plotting in that time to do the CPD element of it, that, the legislation, the qualifications to become competent. And then what we've also seen is a number of contractors who are struggling to identify exactly what competency is required because the legislation has changed a couple of times and it's shifted. We all saw what happened with the EWS one, and then there was the rollback on it, and then there was new guidance. So contractors are sort of trying to keep up and work out what competency, what qualifications the industry wants from them. And for me, that's been particularly challenging with there's been a few missteps and, it's not been an easy task to just leap from unregulated to regulated in quite a short space of time because it's a massive upskill for the whole industry.
Yeah, I must say that's quite eye-opening for me, putting it in relation to a degree. I mean, that's a lot of things to take in alongside a full-time job.
Absolutely.
When you look at the current regime, it sounds like it's a big step forward compared to how it used to be. But it's also quite like a big endeavor. Are there some unintended consequences or places where you feel like it's not quite working for property managers or leaseholders?
I suppose one of the places that's always difficult, and this relates to leasehold in general as opposed to the Building Safety Act specifically, is where we as an industry could actually add massive value to our customers and clients ultimately would be to try and make sure their service charges don't escalate out of control. And we're not just constantly asking for more money all the time from our leaseholders. And one of the ways that you could do that as an industry is we could look at economies of scale. We could look at, instructing one broker across the entire portfolio. It would limit the administration. It would limit the amount of time. If you find one really competent contractor that can address multiple buildings for you, it's more cost effective and we can really drive costs for leaseholders down. Unfortunately, the way the leasehold framework is set up in the United Kingdom is the pressure is on us to give every single individual building complete say around who they use and how they use them. Now, I fully support them being a participant in the building management, but unfortunately it puts us in a position where those economies of scale get stripped back and you're not able to really drive the costs down. all of our leaseholders are telling us that that's their number one priority, is to not have extremely expensive service charges. It prevents them selling their properties. It makes the rents higher. It's all really challenging for them. But actually in leasehold, you have to ensure everybody in the building gets a say on who you use. It's a very democratic process around what contractors are involved. And that, unfortunately, means that every single individual building and block has a bespoke arrangement around the work that's being done in their building. So it would be useful as an industry if we were allowed to access those economies of scale so that we can work hard to bring the costs down for people. But unfortunately, we're really limited on what we can do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, if you look at the sort of wider economy and you look at the same time frame, say 20, 30 years, like there is almost like a general trend towards like slightly bigger companies or a bit more streamlining, a bit more consolidation in the industries. And of course, that has been driving big productivity gains in the private sector. So I can certainly see that. That's an interesting observation. Are there some gaps between like what the law is sort of expecting from you and what you feel like the industry is capable of delivering?
The industry is moving towards common hold, which again is about more autonomy for each individual leaseholder. And again, if you put that into a net zero context or a sustainability context, it actually makes absolutely no sense for us to be in a position where we're sending 42 different gardeners in 42 different vans to 42 different sites that could all just be a mile apart ultimately. But the drive is very much towards a common hold framework where that's exactly what we will be doing, because each group of leaseholders will have their own preferences and recommendations and things like that. So it does make it very challenging to meet the net zero goals, to do a lot of work on your supply chain and ensure that it's the most environmentally impactful it can be, or the least environmentally impactful that it can be. So I think that there's a little bit of a disjointed sort of methodology there around trying to do things more efficiently and better, because there is a lot of productivity around, like you say, some of the larger companies are going towards making sure that their supply chain is efficient as it possibly can be. But what we tend to see is that is causing them to lose business because leaseholders feel left out and feel like they don't have a say in what's going on. And you often see it in the news, that they don't want to use the freeholders broker. They don't want to use the freeholders utility broker. And these are all things that are designed to improve the outcome, as in their service charge reduces, and the environmental impact of the supply chains that are building reduces. But legally, the framework is very much leaning towards those things being removed, and everything being done on an individual basis, on a per building basis.
And so why is that? Like, what is the counter argument to, better economies of scale and maybe more professionalism in the industry?
I think the counter argument from leaseholders is cost. It's a cost of living crisis. And from their point of view, they want control over who comes to their building and how that happens. They want transparency around that. And when you lump together multiple contracts, that transparency isn't always there. It should be, but unfortunately, there's often from some of our leaseholders, there's a sort of a feeling that if it's one big contract like that there's a monopoly, that there's add-ons, that they're being, their costs are going in the wrong direction, that's out of their control. So they do have a preference for, a local contractor that they know and trust, and, they can Google them on their website and things like that. So, they just don't quite balance out because, and I understand it because, for me personally, having no control over which roofer I bring to my house, having no control over which insurance broker I use feels like a lack of transparency. Even if there are cost savings to be made, you want control over where you live. It's very personal, isn't it? It's your home. So, and I think sometimes, it lacks transparency, and leaseholders feel that, and they push back on it.
I'm a relatively new homeowner, And I must say, there are days when I wish someone would send me a roofer rather than me having to find someone.
Yes, this is true. This is true.
What is this type of safety work that you get mandated by the Building Safety Act? What does that look like on a day-to-day level when you're implementing it in a new building?
My experience so far of the Building Safety Act is there's very much sort of what I'd say 3 categories of buildings. So the easiest ones to manage under the Building Safety Act are the things that are slightly newer, and you're in a situation where all of the paperwork is in place, all of the O&M manuals for all the safety equipment's in place. So it's very easy for a property manager to look at all that information, understand how the building is supposed to react in a fire, educate their leaseholders on what that looks like. So it's very, very sort of simple scenario. You've then got a category of buildings sort of built maybe, I don't know, between about 1980 and sort of 2010. Quite often there's a real lack of paperwork. There's not always the same sign off as there should have been. And those buildings are quite challenging because you're almost having to pick them apart. You're pulling off architraves to see if the compartmentation is solid. You're checking lift shafts to, because you don't have the as-built drawings. You don't have the information there to be able to really assess what the fire strategy is, what the structural sort of strategy is for the building. And then the toughest category for me is you've got these old mansion Victorian blocks and you have nothing. You have absolutely nothing. You don't even have building regs from the period to rely on. And those are the buildings that, are really, really challenging on them to try and understand what the methodology was in 1862 around the fire strategy for the building. And you find a lot of leaseholders in those buildings becoming quite frustrated because it's really difficult to retrospectively take a building from the 1800s and make it 2025 fire compliant. And sometimes the recommendations from fire risk assessors and, that they seem a bit bonkers. It's like, let's take off these absolutely stunning 200-year-old oak doors and replace them with some naff fire door from 2025. And as you can imagine, the residents are up in arms saying, no, we don't want that to happen. And those buildings, they're more interesting from a property manager's point of view because you're having to come up with solutions and you're having to debate those solutions with fire inspectors and, trying to find, is it actually safe? But the sad thing is the only way to check if that fire door is capable of holding back fire for 30 minutes is to set something alight, which we're just not going to do because that's... Yeah, no. So those ones are really quite, and, it's really interesting because a lot of it is about, do we need to retrofit it? Is it reasonable? Is it proportionate to do these things? Are we comfortable that it would definitely behave as we expect it to behave? And it's nice to see more and more solutions coming out in the industry about how to test those things without being destructive, without, destroying the fabric of the building and, looking at what the fire strategy needs to be as opposed to what the fire strategy should be if it was a new build in 2025. So, yeah, those property managers at the front line on the mansion blocks, they're having the toughest time because nothing is standard, everything is bespoke, and they're really having to put together a jigsaw puzzle of how this building's going to behave, in an event that happens.
Yeah, that's a choice I don't envy anyone having to make between safety and keeping the building beautiful.
And I think one of the things that's most challenging in that arena is around not very many people are insured to the level of making that call to say, look, that fire door, it will work. The insurance, the public liability insurance being wrong in that scenario is quite extortionate. And unfortunately, what that means is there's fewer and fewer people within the industry who are adequately competent and insured to make those calls. Sometimes we've got ex-fire officers on site and they're like, no, that will be fine. But I can't give you that in writing because, unfortunately, my PI insurance won't allow me to give you that in writing. So, again, that creates other challenges because the reality is without setting something on fire, we don't know. We hope it would work, but, we don't know.
And I hope you wouldn't set 200-year-old doors on fire just to see if they can last another 10.
Yeah, exactly.
If there was something you could change tomorrow about the framework, what would it be?
The biggest thing I would change is around there's an enormous amount of leaseholder learning to do. There's a huge amount of education needs to happen with the people who actually live in the buildings. Managing agents are trying really hard to get that information out there, but because it becomes from the managing agent, if a leaseholder in that building hasn't got a great relationship with their managing agent, they're likely to just dismiss that advice. For me, I'd love to see some more centralised leaseholder learning that's coming out either at government level, at the regulator level. So what we've seen so far is one training course for directors of management companies and a poster issued for a high-rise building, which I don't feel is enough coming from central government to educate leaseholders on what's currently going on within the industry. And it can often feel like to a leaseholder that all we're doing is pushing their prices up and pushing their costs up, and you know, that just feels very unfair to them. So we do a huge amount of work around leaseholder learning. We've colour coordinated all of our budgets to highlight what life safety elements are within the building, you know, to try, but because it's coming from their managing agent, it doesn't always land. Whereas centralised leaseholder education, I think, is really critical to get the message across about what the industry is trying to do.
Yeah, and it can be quite hard to unpack profit and loss statement or a budget for a layman.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the industry. What uncomfortable truth do you think that the wider industry still needs to confront about its own role in safety failures?
We're bearing the brunt of a lot of construction failures, particularly in that period from the 80s through to the early 2000s. There was clearly, to my mind, all of the evidence I see is that for whatever reason during that period, the building regulations weren't being monitored closely enough. And actually, that framework is devastating for some buildings. You know, we are unpicking buildings from that period, and the compartmentation is awful. If I give you a little quick case study, I won't mention the building by name ultimately, but what's happened within the building is an entire automatic vent system has been installed to remove smoke from the building in the event of a fire. And then because it was a little unattractive decoratively, it's been adjusted to look prettier. And it's been signed off. It's been signed off by building regs. It's got its building safety certificate. So that AOV system, to have it removed and put back in properly, will end up costing in the region of £300,000. You know, it's an entire volume. It's, you know, so there's elements of that where, that should never have happened. And actually at the moment, it's the property management industry that are having to pick up the flack for that happening. And it's, the building standards, it's so important that these buildings are built correctly. And it's so important that where they haven't been built correctly, the right people step up and fund, the remediation on those buildings, because it's so unfair for, I imagine if it was my little boy buying his first house, he buys a flat and he moves in and he can afford his little service charge and everything's brilliant and it's lovely. And then suddenly someone turns around and says, sorry, £300,000 bill to fix your AOV, your portion of that £5,000. That's a hideous situation to be in and it will put people off buying freehold properties, so some, not all, there are some people behaving brilliantly in this arena, but there are some developers who are just not playing ball in this scenario, and they're going through litigation, which is adding further costs. So, it's so important that where the building hasn't been built correctly, the right people step up and put their hand in their pocket to fix what they should have done correctly in the first place.
Has the building standards evolved, or was it more a case of developers maybe not adhering to the standards that were in place?
I have an opinion on this, and I could be wrong. I'm
we like opinions.
Yeah. From what I've seen within the industry, it was an issue around, if you go back pre-80s, there was building inspectors from the local authority who were very, very visible on site, checking that things were done properly. During the 80s, it moved to an insurance-backed promise that the building was built correctly by things like NHBC and places like that. And I'm not sure that they had as much teeth as the building inspectors had. I think the building inspectors could shut down a building site. They could refuse to sign off a building. Whereas unfortunately, when that moved to a private sector insurance backed product, they didn't have the same teeth. And at roughly the same time, there was a big move towards the construction industry having no employees and 0-hour contracts with self-employed builders, self-employed carpenters, and those two things combined, I think, took away the responsibility for the standards, and I think that's what caused this big issue between that, those groups. And what we've done now is we've moved back to a world where we have a building safety regulator. The sign off is much more stringent. There's much more teeth. They can shut down a building. And for me, those are the buildings that are the worst. Stuff before that still seems to be built pretty well. Stuff in that period isn't. And the new stuff that's coming through is meeting the standard. It's coming through Gateway 2. It's built well, correctly. So for me, that's what's gone wrong, is that sort of lack of just teeth within the building safety arena, and the oversight on ensuring everything sort of met the standards. I've got some awful stories from friends who are sort of in the construction industry back in those periods where they would be self-employed, either carpenter or whatever. They'd turn up on site on the day. There'd be doors missing, but they would only get their day rate if they fitted a specific number of doors. So they would steal hinges off doors in the other block just so they could hit their day rate. And, those types of stories disturbed me, because I think that's probably why a lot of these things haven't actually been fitted as well as they should, because it's all individual people trying to hit a day rate as opposed to wider oversight with a building safety person coming and visiting and making sure everyone's doing it correctly.
With a bit more accountability, I think that sounds like what was missing there for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's some very good and actionable advice for any listener who is about to buy a house or an apartment. So look into the future. If you look 3 to 5 years ahead, what's your personal thesis on how building safety will reshape the property management industry?
My hope is that it becomes business as usual, and actually we're seeing that, like I say, the buildings coming through Gateway 2, and we settle back into a much more natural place of, we've upped the standards, but it's happening across the board. We've got an enormous hump to get over to get to that point, because there are a lot of buildings that require a lot of remediation and bringing up to standard. But my hope, it reminds me of way back when in the industry when, things like the fire risk assessments and health and safety became compulsory. Everyone was like, oh my God, it's this massive headache. We've got all these extra tasks to do. But actually now they're business as usual, and most property managers just go through the flow, tick it off. No problem. So my hope for the industry is that we upskill everyone that needs to be upskilled. We move into a more regulated industry, and building safety just becomes business as usual, the way it should have been throughout.
And if a property manager wants to stay ahead of that change, what are some of the things that they should be doing today?
The most useful thing I found to upskill myself was actually reading Dame Judith Hackett's report. A lot of people were aware of the report, but didn't sit down and read it. And actually, if you read that report, it gives you a really good basis for understanding what's gone wrong and how we can put it right. It's probably, the best bit of advice I could give any property manager is actually read that report, and you will get a really good understanding. Everything she says in that report is absolute common sense. Your residents need to know what to do if there's a fire. These aren't massive concepts that you struggle to wrap your head around. It's a very basic. It needs to be built correctly. We need to understand how the building works, and we need to educate our leaseholders on how to do that. And I think if you keep that at the core of your planning and your thinking around your education, your upskilling, your regulation, then you can't go far wrong in the industry.
Excellent. Christmas reading sorted.
Absolutely. A little bit of bedtime reading for anyone out there interested in becoming a property manager.
To wrap up on a more personal note, everyone in property management, they have a few crazy stories that they've come across over the years. What's yours?
Craziest story I've got actually was the absolute horror one day of realising that we had gone through all the legislative process. We'd done a Section 20 consultation. We'd gone out to leaseholders and we'd arranged to have their building decorated internally, new carpets replaced. And we spent the day with residents ringing saying, we thought they were coming today. Your letter said they were coming today. They haven't turned up. We were like, so we phoned the contractor. The contractor said, yeah, we're here. We're on site. No, we fed it back and we went back and forward all day until eventually the penny dropped that they were decorating the wrong building. And the contractors had gone to the wrong building, and this building got an entirely free internal decoration accidentally, which was horrifying, as you can imagine, because we had to replan the entire project, and there was a lot of negotiations during that period. But yeah, a very lucky group of leaseholders got an entire building decorated for nothing.
That's amazing. That's one I've never heard before. Thank you so much, Polly. It was a pleasure speaking to you. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Brilliant. Thanks. It was lovely to meet you.
Thank you for listening to Minute by Minute. If today's episode gave you fresh insight, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Share this episode with your team and follow us on social media to continue the conversation and exchange your own operational stories. To learn more about privacy-first property protection, visit minute.com. Until next time, make every minute count to maintain your property's safety.